So welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 2 for chapter 25, and in fact this is going to be our final screencast for chapter 25 because we have one more order that we need to look at, and this is the order Anura. Now this particular order is going to contain the frogs and the toads, and in this very large order we have about 5,283 species that have been discovered at this point for this order. And like any other amphibians, water is going to be very important to these animals because they cannot reproduce without water. And of course, as we had said before, their skin is very, very thin, so a lot of these animals might actually breathe through their skin. So water is going to be very important for them. In other words, they have a water permeable skin, which means water can actually move back and forth. Now, these animals do practice ectothermy, which is going to prevent the Anurians from inhabiting any type of polar or subarctic habitats. Now, remember, ectothermy is going to refer to a type of animal that actually regulates its body temperature based on its surroundings. In other words, if the temperature goes up, their body temperature will actually go up, and if the temperature definitely goes down, their body temperature is going to go down as well. So their environment plays a really critical role in how these animals maintain themselves. Now, most of the animals found in this order will have a tailed larvae stage, more commonly known as the tadpole, and they will have a tailless jumping adult stage, all except for one species. Now there's going to be 44 families of frogs and toads that are going to be found in this particular order, and we're not going to mention all 44 families, but we are going to just do a really quick look at 3 of those families. And the first family is the family Ranidae, and this is going to contain the much larger frogs that we have here in North America called the bullfrogs. And in fact, these frogs are really common from the part of the country that I'm from the Midwest. These are rather aggressive frogs. In other words, these are frogs that will actually go out and sometimes they'll even take down, in addition to insects, they'll take down baby animals, they'll take down small mammals, sometimes they'll even take down some small birds, and they'll oftentimes take down other frogs as well as they feed. Around here in these parts of the country, the family Hylidae, which includes the tree frogs, are pretty numerous. In fact, these are the type of frogs that you oftentimes hear in the evenings. And the third family is the family Bufonidae, and these are what we consider the true toads. And so this is going to be a group of Anurans where they tend to spend a little bit more time away from the water. They can inhabit a little bit more of a dry environment because they contain a much thicker skin, which is going to help them to retain water. And what's kind of common with this particular family of Anurans is they are sort of characterized as having sort of like wart-like structures on the outside as well. So if you take a really good look at the toad over here on the right-hand side, and you look right about here, this is a good example of one of those wart-like structures you might find on these animals. Now, getting warts from a frog or a toad is definitely an old wives' tale. Oftentimes these warts will contain sort of a toxic substance that sort of helps these animals to defend themselves from predators, but as for causing warts, it's not really something that occurs with this group of animals. Now, something that's pretty significant when you talk about frogs and toads is their ability to be really good indicators when it comes down to environmental health. Overall, Anurans are declining, actually worldwide, and they're becoming what we consider geographically fragmented, which means that when you have a particular Anuran that's been pretty common in a very large, let's say, range within a particular area, that because of various environmental influences, that area has become fragmented or sort of broken apart, so you're only actually able to find those Anurans in certain pockets of that area. Now, oftentimes these pockets are produced because in certain areas of that habitat, you have various types of let's just say unfavorable environmental influences. Would be things like could be pesticides, could be herbicides. In other words, some sort of pollution that is sort of affecting possibly the life cycle of that Anuran. In other words, these animals are super sensitive to the environment, and a lot of it is due to because they have a very thin skin. So whatever is put into the environment oftentimes is going to be taken in by that animal pretty quickly. And oftentimes it doesn't show itself until these animals actually reproduce. And so if you notice over here, oftentimes they're going to talk about the life history of that animal. So as they reproduce, what you're noticing is you're noticing a lot of malformations. In other words, problems with that animal as it kind of goes from that tadpole stage to the adult stage. Now down here towards the right-hand side, you're going to notice that we definitely have a frog that has some issues. If you notice, the limbs of this frog are definitely malformed. This particular frog would have a really super tough time, if not impossible time, time being able to survive in the wild. And oftentimes you'll notice down here on the bottom left, you can have varying degrees of malformation, which means that sometimes these animals might actually be able to make it to a certain point within that very restricted environment, but of course they're still compromised. And when you see a very large number of these animals in a particular area, that's often a good indicator that there's something going on. As we had said, a lot of times it has to do with, could be pesticides, could be herbicides, could be an infection of some sort. For example, up here you notice it talks about trematodes, which were those flatworms. We often called them flukes. In other words, maybe there's a parasite that's sort of influencing the genetic nature of this animal or its ability to, as we had said, go from a tadpole to an adult. And sometimes there's simple DNA errors that are occurring, and oftentimes these errors might be caused by, say, for example, an increase in UV radiation, which is going to definitely, and it's kind of like skin cancer in our case, where it's going to influence the ability of that DNA to code correctly, and of course it's going to produce the malformations that you see here. So a lot of these amphibians are actually really easy prey for other animals. And so what they've had to do is they've actually had to develop some pretty unique strategies when it comes down to defending themselves from these predators. You do actually have some amphibians out there, which we don't normally think of them as being aggressive, that are relatively aggressive towards other animals. And it's a good way to protect themselves. In fact, a lot of your larger toads and some of your larger frogs, like bullfrogs, for example, can be pretty aggressive. Concealment or camouflage is another way that these animals can actually help to protect themselves. If you can't see them, you can't eat them. In fact, poison glands are another way that these animals can defend themselves as well. Over here on the right-hand side, you see an example of, I think this is a cane toad, that gives you a really close-up view of the parotoid gland. And in fact, a lot of people think of this thing sort of like a really large wart on these toads. But in fact, it's not a wart at all. It's a very large gland that actually can secrete a really toxic substance. And in fact, these cane toads are often really prevalent when you visit the Hawaiian Islands. So they're kind of tropical in nature, but if you ever hold these toads, they can secrete that substance, which can actually cause you to get sick. In fact, a lot of dogs, for example, will sort of play with or take these toads into their mouth, and it causes the dogs to salivate quite a bit. So it's definitely a good way to protect yourself. The poison arrow dart frogs, for example, are again another example of where they have poison glands that they can secrete through their skin that help to protect themselves from predators as well. Now, many species have suffered from changes in the environment, as we had talked about in the previous screen, and climate that's been brought about by us humans. So again, if you think about the greenhouse effect, the changes in temperature, etc., when you have an animal that has a very thin skin, anything that you put into the environment, if you change the temperature just a little bit, oftentimes can be pretty detrimental to that particular type of group of animals. So another example of that would be climatic changes that actually reduce water depth at reproductive sites. So in the previous screen we had talked about things like herbicides, UV exposure, pesticides, but something as simple as reducing the amount of water can also have some pretty drastic effects. As you can see here, it's going to increase the UV exposure of those developing embryos. And so of course when you do that, you get more of a likelihood of those DNA mistakes occurring, and of course you get those malformations that are going to result from those mistakes. And also of course, anytime you make these animals a little less fit for their environment, it's going to open them up or make them more susceptible to diseases you might find in that environment. And in this case with amphibians, fungal infections can be pretty detrimental to an entire population of amphibians. So the decline of some amphibians even may be caused by other amphibians. So we're talking about non-native species actually being introduced into an environment. And Bufo marinus, which is going to be that cane toad that we had talked about, is a good example of sort of an introduction of a species that wasn't there before that will tend to annihilate or basically take out other amphibians that are native to that area. Now, reproduction and development in amphibians, kind of similar to what we had looked at with the salamanders and the Sicilians, is going to vary a bit depending on the type of frog or toad that you're looking at. But typically, when you look at this particular group of animals, you have a male that will actually work to call or attract the females. And as we had said around here, you have the You have the tree frogs that are pretty prevalent. So in the evenings, when it's a nice warm evening, you can hear them calling for females. When the eggs are mature, the female is going to enter the water because remember these animals are tied to water because that's where their eggs need to develop. You can't take away the moisture because their shells are so incredibly thin. And what's going to happen is the male is going to clasp the female in a way that we call amplexus. And you can see amplexus right over here on the right hand side. And if you notice, this darker frog right here is going to be the male, and he has his front legs that are clasped really tightly behind that female's neck. And during this time is when the female is going to release her eggs, and he's going to release the sperm at the same time. So once the female releases the eggs and they're fertilized, there's going to be a really thick jelly layer that's going to actually swell around the eggs, and that's going to swell because it's going to simply absorb the water in the environment. Now, most of the time, the eggs are going to be laid in rather large masses, again, depending on the species that we're looking at, and development is going to begin almost immediately. And typically, the tadpole is going to hatch in about 6 to 9 days. And as we had said, these are going to be aquatic animals for a brief period of time. They most often will have a very long, finned tail. They're not going to have any legs yet, and they'll have both internal and external gills. Typically, the external gills will be pretty visible for the first few days. Then those will actually recede into the animal, and the internal gills will take over. Most of the time when you talk about frogs and toads, the tadpoles themselves, which is the term that we're going to use for the larval stage of these animals, are going to be herbivorous. In other words, they're going to have more of a plant-based diet. And so what they're going to have is they're going to have what we consider horny jaws, and they're going to use sort of a ventral adhesive disc that's going to help them to cling to objects, and these jaws are going to be used to scrape or take in that plant matter. As we had said in the previous screen, there's going to be 3 pairs of external gills that will eventually develop into internal gills, and these are going to be covered with a flap of skin. And in fact, on the right-hand side of the tadpole, we're going to have an operculum, and this is a word that we had seen back when we talked about the fish, that's going to fuse with the body wall. Now on the left side of the animal, we're going to have a structure called a spiracle that will actually remain. Remember, we talked about the spiracles when we looked at the sharks. So in this case, the water is going to enter the mouth, it's going to flow past the gills, and then it's going to flow out of the spiracle. Now, when metamorphosis actually occurs, now metamorphosis means to change, the hind legs are going to appear first. The forelegs, which are kind of temporarily hidden in folds of the operculum, are going to be there, but we won't quite see them quite yet. The tail is going to eventually be reabsorbed. The intestine is going to become a bit shorter, so you're going to have sort of a rearrangement of that digestive system, and it's primarily because the diet of these animals is going to change. You're going to go from a herbivorous type of diet, which requires an intestinal tract that's a bit longer, to more of a animal-based diet. In other words, they're going to become carnivores. And the mouth is going to transform to the adult condition, which basically means you're not going to have a mouth with those horny jaws. Now you're going to have a mouth, most likely, that's going to have a very long tongue. In other words, the way that they actually feed is going to be very different. So you have to sort of rearrange how that mouth is as well. The lungs are going to develop, and in this case, those internal gills are now going to be reabsorbed. So the males are going to migrate back to the breeding ponds or streams during reproduction as well. Now, as I had mentioned before, there's going to be kind of a difference in terms of reproductive strategy depending on the type of Anuran that we're actually looking at. If you're looking at a more tropical Anuran, they have some pretty unique reproductive strategies themselves. Some of them will actually lay eggs in what we consider foam masses that are going to float on the surface of the water. And you can see an example of this right here. Some are going to deposit their eggs on leaves that are overhanging ponds and streams. And so, of course, once the eggs hatch, the tadpoles are going to drop down into that aquatic environment. Others are going to place their eggs in water trapped in tree cavities or water-filled chambers of bromeliads. And so over here on the right, you can see what looks like a bromeliad plant, and you can see the eggs right here, and you can see the parent frog right here. And then over here, you can see some eggs that have been deposited on the underside of a leaf. So once those eggs hatch, the embryo, of course, is going to drop down into the water. Now, what's really neat with some of these more tropical amphibians is you actually have some of these frogs that will take care of their eggs for a brief period of time. In fact, some of them will actually even take care of their tadpoles as well. Poison dart frogs tend to be one of these groups. In fact, there's a few species out there where once the eggs hatch, the parent will actually carry the tadpole on the back of the frog for a brief period of time. Now, marsupial frogs are going to carry their eggs in a pouch on the back, and you can see a good example of this over here on the right hand side. These swellings that you see right here are the eggs of this frog. And if you notice, there's really not too many of these eggs because they do such a great job in terms of parental care. Now, once these eggs hatch, the back of this frog is going to rupture, and this is an example where they will actually hatch directly into what we consider froglets. And so they sort of bypass that tadpole stage and are actually somewhat similar to the adults that you see right here. All right, so that's going to finish this up for chapter 25. As I said, this is our final screencast for this chapter. Now, something to let you know is that what we're going to do with chapter 25 is we're actually going to assess this chapter with chapter 26, which is on reptiles. So it's even more important that you make sure to get your screencast study guide done before you come to class.